I don't wanna grow up, I'm a curious kid. The world has 100 questions I can play with. So I'll open my arms and eyes and wonder every day till the day I die. No one really knows why gravity exists.
We're going to start off today, hopefully. I'm going to warn you right now, I do have one former student in the room, and as she already knows, you will absolutely leave here with more questions than answers. If you do, then that means I've done my job. So this right here, hopefully we all recognize this particular skull. It should look very familiar. This is indeed a Homo sapiens skull. So when we're thinking of humans, this is sort of the baseline that we'll be working with. And I've got some others here that I'll be reaching for throughout tonight. But I was helped along to find this topic by Tucker, and he is very adamant that there are other humans, but I have deliberately thrown in a question mark because it's actually really hard to determine what we mean by human. So when we think about humans, we're generally thinking about creatures that have split off from a much deeper family tree. So there's one lineage in that family tree that leads to modern-day chimpanzees, modern-day bonobos, and there's another whole lineage of that tree that leads to a bunch of other creatures, one of which is this big genus that we belong to, which is the genus Homo. So we are Homo sapiens. Our genus name is Homo. Our species name is sapiens. And generally when we think of what it means to be human, we're thinking about creatures that are bipedal. Right? So compared to other primates that are living today, we are bipedal. Hopefully you've all got here mostly bipedally. One always has to ask, my students always have to think about it. We all have relatively big brains compared to our body. And this is true of all primates. But in particular, humans are even more sort of what we call encephalized. We have brains that are even bigger than you would expect to find on a primate of our body size. And that all primates as a group have brains that are bigger than you would anticipate given their body size compared to any other mammal of a similar body size. So humans do have these really big brains. So when you're looking at this skull here, and you think, wow, that has, there's a really big brain back here, you're right. It's on average about 1,350 cc's or 1,350 cubic centimeters, and it fits that space right back there. So we're mostly familiar with humans. We feel pretty good about this. We look in the mirror. We recognize that we have this very clear precision grip. We're able to grasp things between our thumb and our forefinger. We don't have to grab things along the side because our fingers are short enough to be able to do it tip to tip. We are relatively hairless across our bodies, so no matter what any of you may think about previous partners you may have had, they are indeed relatively hairless, certainly far less hairy than any of our primate cousins. As a group, we have what we call very low sexual dimorphism. So sexual dimorphism, di referring to two and morph referring to shapes or types, means that males and females of the species generally look relatively similar, but they differ a little bit. So there is, on average, males do tend to be a little bit taller than females. Males tend to be ever so slightly heavier than females. But one thing that we all have, and you can probably just about make this out here, is that you'll notice that we don't have canines that extend beyond the tooth row, as we say. So when you run your finger along here, you run the tongue along either your maxillar teeth, your upper teeth, or your mandibular teeth, your lower teeth, there's a little bit of a bump when you hit the canine on either side. But it's not a big bump. It's not, you don't have canines that are this big and then the rest of the teeth that are this big. So there's a little bit of a bump there. We don't have very much sexual dimorphism there at all. And this is primarily because of changes in diet. But compared to some of the earlier groups that we'll look at, this is something that's changed. So within the Homo genus, we're all going to have these much smaller canines, and in general, across the group, we're going to have much smaller teeth than what we find earlier in the fossil record. And then humans, when we think of humans, and this is something that we're not going to be able to see in the fossil record, is we recognize that human babies are really helpless. And this is really weird. So if you think about primate babies, if you've ever seen pictures of baby chimpanzees or baby monkeys, they're born, they grab onto mom or dad or both right away. They get carried around everywhere. They can do all kinds of things for themselves. They have what we call object permanence by 6 months of age. So if you take a toy away from a baby monkey, if they're playing with a toy, or you take away their little bit of food and you hide it underneath the blanket, the baby monkey goes straight for it, knows exactly where it is. Now I urge you, should you have small people in your life, and by small I mean young, if you have young people in your life who are, under the age of 9 months, you can play this game. This is what makes peekaboo so fun. So what you can do is while they're playing with the toy, you can gently take the toy from them, and then you can hide it underneath the blanket. And generally what happens once they're, say, that same age of around 6 months is, it's gone. The second you cover that toy with a blanket, it's gone. And you're like, huh? Yeah, well, that was interesting. What are we going to do now? And then you pull the blanket back off, and the toy comes back down. You're like, wow, this is amazing. It came out of nowhere. So developmentally, we're also quite interesting. But again, that's something we're not going to be able to see in the fossil record. So this is a family tree, or one type of family tree. There are many, many out there if you search for them on the internet. This one comes from the Smithsonian, so all rights to them. And this has a nice timeline along the bottom. So it goes from very oldest is down here at the bottom, and the very youngest today is up here at the top. So this is the branch that leads off to common chimpanzees and bonobo chimpanzees. So that's this unlabeled branch way out here. And the rest of us, all of these groups, are what we consider to be hominids. These are in some way bipedal apes, so we all differ in some ways from this other group that leads to the group known as Pan. Very early, we have some of these Ardipithecus groups. So if you've ever heard of Ardipithecus ramidus, then that's in this group. There's an Australopithecus group. These are, if you've heard of Lucy, so Australopithecus afarensis, that falls into this big clump over here. There's another big clump known as Paranthropus, and so these are very similar to Australopithecines. They exist in a very similar time frame, but they were what we call megadont. They have very, very big teeth, particularly very big back teeth. So their incisors and their canines were crowded out a little bit. They're a little bit smaller because the molars and the premolars were so big in those species. So they look very, very different from the other Australopithecus. And then you get this group up here. And this is the group of the genus Homo. Or to put this another way, instead of using sort of the tree diagram, what you oftentimes get are timelines that look like this. And this is because, of course, these fossils existed through time, and so this shows some of the time depth that we find these. I've actually had to add Homo juluensis here. It wasn't on this diagram, so if you're wondering why this one looks funny, that's because I threw it in there. Had to edit what I was working with. So here it's color-coded. So in yellow, and I've cut it off, there are more that are down here. In yellow, these are the Australopithecus species. So Lucy and Hurricane all fall in here. This is that Paranthropus group. So these are those thicker, molar folk that are very similar to Australopithecus, but differ a lot, particularly in cranial features. And then these groups in red, these are all the Homo. I take it back. These are not all the Homo. These are all the Homo that this particular article had identified. Because it really depends on how many you count. Because there's a problem when you're working with fossils. Okay, so first of all, who knows what a species is? Someone take a stab at what a species is. Tucker.
A species has reproductive isolation. I've got a better way to say it. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, so reproduction absolutely plays a role in what we think of as species. So oftentimes we think of species as organisms that you can put in a room, they'll make babies, and you stick their babies in a room and they'll make more babies. They stick their babies in a room and they'll make more babies. So we're like, okay, you get two dogs, of relevant sizes. Do not take the Great Dane with the Chihuahuas. But 2 sensibly sized dogs, you stick them in a room, they can have puppies. And then those puppies can mate with other puppies and get more puppies, and we're like, aha, okay, we feel pretty good that this is at least some type of biological species. But there are lots of different ways in which we can identify species, because sometimes you can't just put things in a room, because they might be separated by things like geography. So if there's a group of animals that are way down in Southeast Asia, and there's a group of animals that live way over in Africa and they don't fly, I'll say they're land mammals, they're never going to reproduce together because they're never going to come across one another. Right? So we tend to consider those different species because they're never going to run into one another. So they're geographically isolated. Or you can be reproductively isolated if your bits are not compatible with somebody else's bits. I'll let you figure that one out for yourselves. But if you've never looked it up, look up ducks. That's a very perfect example of bits needing to fit other bits. If you're not compatible in anatomy, then that's another way in which you can be different species, is that you're just not able. You might be interested, but you're not able to. You may be able to, but it turns out your genetics don't match. So, you get a human and a chimpanzee, which is an experiment we will never do. And if you have to ask why, you're wonder-nots, you know better. So if you took a human and chimpanzee, technically, maybe, even if things could work out, they call this, by the way, a humanzee. So if you have that, the problem is, even if you got an offspring out, the offspring would have an odd number of chromosomes, because humans and chimpanzees have different numbers of chromosomes. So even if you get an offspring out, the offspring itself is likely to be sterile. So you can't then take 2 humanzees, imaginary, put them in a room and see if they make more, because they won't. You see this also with, is it mules? Donkeys. It's horses and mules that come together to make donkeys. There we go. Or ligers, I think, are another one. So, you get these hybrids, but their offspring themselves can't produce young. And then, of course, there are differences in behavior. So, the genetics can match up, the anatomy can match up, but if you just don't find that other creature sexy, then you're never going to have sex with them, I hope. Again, we're humans, we're a little bit different. But, if the other bird could be dancing, and then you're like, nope, not doing it for me. So eventually you're going to get, different species, because this group is like, nope, don't like the dancing. This other group's like, we totally love the dancing. Over time, you're going to accumulate other differences, and over time, you end up with 2 species. So again, some of these things aren't going to work with fossils. You can't put fossils in a room, I hope, and expect to get babies out. Because if, you stuck 2 skulls in a room, and you came back later and there were more skulls, you have been pranked, and it is April Fool's. So that clearly will not work. So we rely a lot more on behavior when we can figure it out, a lot more on geography, a lot more on just physical features. So we have to make a subjective leap. You have to say, look, these things are different enough that maybe we should consider them to be different species. Now what I should say is, here on erectus, so I've got erectus on the right here. So this is Homo erectus, an early creature of the genus Homo. And I think over here I've got habilis right here, and I've got rudolfensis right here, and their names that'll come back, so I just wanted to introduce them. And I should say that there's one of the reasons why diagrams like this get tricky is that generally, if you find something new and different, and if it's different enough that you can then propose a name for it, then you get to name it. So clearly, if you find something with just enough differences, you really want to be the first one to name it, because then if someone else comes along and finds something that turns out to belong to your group, their name doesn't count. So there is a naming priority system as well. So there are groups, some folks that are called lumpers, which is we want to shove everyone together. So, this is all Africanus, and this is all some sort of Paranthropus, and all of these, this is just Homo erectus, and then Homo sapiens. They're going to lump everyone together. All that variation doesn't mean anything really important. And then there are splitters, the extreme other end, which is every little difference I want to call something else. And then we could have, you can get one of these diagrams with like 30 different names on it. All Homo something or other. I'm not going to talk about all of them. So there are lumpers and there are splitters. And eventually what happens is through a lot of arguments, and a lot more arguments, and a lot more arguments, you come to some sort of agreement. So most of what I'll cover tonight is stuff that we agree on. So let me shift this out of the way to talk about this first one. So this little one here, this is Homo habilis, little tiny creature, not very big. The remains for Homo habilis date to about 2 million years ago to about 1.6 million years ago. So they're around for a few 100,000 years.
Julie, do you mind questions during the talk, or
No,
would you
no.
rather wait till the end?
You can ask them.
Is there any chance that's a child as opposed to just a small species of
Oh,
Homo?
no. All the teeth are erupted. But it's a good question.
Not a child Homo sapiens, but a child of that, right? That's why it's small.
Yeah, no, because all the molars have come through. So this one is definitely an adult. People much smarter than I have determined this is an adult, mostly because of tooth eruption and bone fusion, so we feel pretty good about that. We find Homo habilis across eastern and southern Africa throughout this time range, and they have relatively small molars, so when you turn them upside down, they don't have massive molars. The molars are pretty appropriate for the size of their skull. They have relatively thin enamels, and they're not chewing anything really, really hard. And even though some of these incisors did not survive the fossilization process, there are actually a couple of incisors in here, and they're not massive, but they're not tiny, so they're kind of in the middle.
So where did he or she come from?
East Africa.
Who was his ancestry?
Well, we're not going to know. That's one of the joys of fossils. So Homo habilis is this one right here. It's one of the earliest Homo species that's been identified, and we don't know. We don't know who comes directly before. We're not even entirely certain who comes directly after. So this is one of those exciting situations where, because you don't have a full fossil record, and because they never leave you a signpost, it would be wonderful if they left us family trees. They're like, oh yes, I've died and I've left my uncle over there and my aunties over there and granddad's over there. Just dig them up. But generally not. And part of the other problem is that we mostly have spent a long time of our evolution in very warm, moist climates. And that is not great for things fossilizing particularly well. So we're not expecting to ever have a full fossil record, unfortunately. So this is habilis here. Now you'll notice that this specimen has this is a key specimen. It has a very nice sort of rounded skull. We kind of like that. Looking very human-like, as we say. So I did do a poll of the room earlier to see which of these skulls perhaps people had dated at some point in their lives. No one picked this one. Homo habilis is very lonely. So Homo habilis here is oftentimes compared to this one. Let me hold these two up. So the one on this side, my left, this is Homo rudolfensis. So we have Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis. And they lived at basically the same time. So this is Homo rudolfensis. But you'll notice a couple of differences, which is, if I hold them up very carefully, I have borrowed these from the College of Marin teaching labs, so thank you, College of Marin. So you'll notice something right away. Yeah, there's a big size difference, and in particular, this one, which is Homo rudolfensis, has a much larger space for the brain, right? So the cranial capacity seems to be much higher in this one. So Homo rudolfensis, also found in East Africa, has a brain capacity we think of closer to 775 cubic centimeters. Right? So it's a significant size up from this one. And they're living at basically the same time. They're overlapping in areas in East Africa. So the idea that there are multiple Homo species that are wandering around the Earth at the same time is not weird. Now, before Tucker has time to ask this question, it was, you're my A+ student over there, it was initially thought that maybe these two specimens were actually a male and female. So it was thought that maybe there was some sexual dimorphism between these two skulls. And since that's pretty much been put to rest, that we've decided that no, they're actually separate species. And a lot of that has to do with generally brain size does not differ that much between a male and a female. And if it does, you should probably worry. Because really, which one's the female, which one's the male? Ah, yeah, you thought that one would be obvious. Okay, so generally, you don't see that big of a brain size difference between males and females. Now, if it were just, if you're thinking of something like gorillas, where when you look at their skulls, the male skull's quite big and elaborate, it's got all this big extra bony structure, none of that is really affecting brain size. It's all extra stuff on top of the skull, it's all this extra bone growth. So if you're thinking of something like that, even though gorilla males look like they have these massive heads, their brains actually are not significantly larger than the female gorillas.
How do we know from the fossils that you have that they weren't able to reproduce?
We don't.
Those two.
We don't know. Now they might not have liked one another. So it could be that one was, doing their cool thing with tools, and the other one's like, your tools look ugly. I don't want to have sex with you. I can say that, right? Okay. There's no watershed hour I should be aware of. So we don't know. And we have not found a hybrid that sits in between. So we haven't found one of, the kid that's like in there with the parents, and you're like, aha, this one has cranial features, since these are mostly cranial features that are in between them. So we don't know. We don't have ancient DNA from them either. So ancient DNA won't save us in this respect. And there's another one that you've probably heard of, but I need to mention because it's a pretty important one, and that's this one. This is just one representative sample of Homo erectus. Homo erectus is a very long-lived species. Sticks around for a very long time. So as you can see, 1.9 million years ago to about 110,000 years ago. So this is a very successful species. We can only hope to survive for as long as Homo erectus did. Homo erectus actually changes quite a bit over the nearly 2 million years that it's around. So this is kind of an intermediate form. They get a little bit bigger than this, they get a little bit smaller than this. So they do change over time. We do see some differences between the erectus that we find in Asia versus the erectus that we find in Africa. And what's really interesting is this skeletal comparison here on the left. So I should say this is one of the most famous Homo erectus finds and why we know exactly what the skeleton looks like. And this is oftentimes known as Narikatomi boy. It's a nearly complete skeleton. So you can, this is really exciting because it's very rare that we find something this complete. And you'll notice a couple things right away, this nice angled femur. So it was very, very good at walking bipedally, as we say. So remember, one of those things that we like to look for to figure out if you belong in the Homo genus is how well you get around on 2 feet, and they got along really well on 2 feet. This is, here on the far left, this is Homo erectus. In the middle, this is Australopithecus afarensis, so you can think of Lucy, that famous skeleton. And this is a modern day Homo sapien. So you'll notice that what we, as we say, post-cranially, so everything from the neck down, looks very modern, right? So if you just pop the skull off, don't do this in the museum, but you pop the skull off, you look at the rest of the skeleton, you think, hey, look, that looks a lot like me. So Homo erectus is, we get really excited because by Homo erectus we know the skeleton is very, very good at being bipedal. They're probably very good at running. They have arches to their feet. They've got quite long leg bones versus arm bones.
Where does Neanderthal fit in this? As a Neanderthal, Homo or?
So here's Homo erectus. So habilis, Rudolfensis. Homo erectus, who's around for a very long time. This is going to be Neanderthals. So.
I can't read that. Homo something or other.
Yeah, so this one's Homo neanderthalensis. It'll be a little bit before we get there because we've still got Floresiensis and we've got Heidelbergensis and then we've got a whole bunch of others. I promise we're getting there.
I just can't read it.
It's okay. It's because I'm only 2 feet from the screen, so that's why I'm able to read it. So Homo erectus is really interesting because the second that we find Homo erectus finds in Africa, we also find very similarly dated finds of Homo erectus all over. And they basically walk across what we call the old world, everything except the Americas. We're just going to run with the terminology. We find them all across Africa, all across Europe, all across Asia, all the way down to what now is the island of Java. But in times of very, very low sea level, you can actually walk. You can actually walk along the continental shelf and get out to what is currently the island of Java. So Erectus gets there. So clearly, whatever they're doing, whatever adaptations they have, whatever behavioral features they have, we know they're using some stone tools. They may also be using non-stone tools. That would not be surprising, but we don't have any fossil evidence for that. So we have to make some guesses about their behavior. So remember that it really helps us if, when you should pass, you carry into the tar pit with you the book, maybe some nice diagrams of electronics carved into stone. This really helps anthropologists that come along after us to go, aha, we know what their technology was like, they're not just records. This is a problem, is that if you're working in bamboo, or you're working in grass, or you're working in wood, this stuff generally does not fossilize. It degrades too quickly, and so really, this is why we're so interested in stone tools. It's because stone tools will stick around, we can date the stone, that really helps.
Did they have bigger eyes?
Not really. Mostly it's just because this isn't a complete reconstruction of the eye orbits. So from pictures they can look really big, but they're not particularly massive. And they have a nice dental arcade, so teeth that look very, very human-like, a little bit bigger in some ways, but not by much.
Were the first two that you showed us, were they erect?
Yes, so everyone that belongs within Homo is definitely bipedal. And actually going back to the Australopithecines, they're also
So
bipedal.
where are the ones that were before that?
So those would be, Ardipithecus is right on the edge. So Ardipithecus ramidus is one that is, hang on. Is he, oh no, he's down here somewhere. So down around 5-6 million years ago, you have Ardipithecus ramidus. We have very good remains of Ardipithecus ramidus, and it looks like there's probably some bipedalism, but they maintain a lot of arboreal features. So it looks like they're okay on the ground, but they're probably not very efficient, and certainly they're not running particularly well, but they're probably okay at walking, but they maintain a lot of ability to get up into the trees. So it will change as we move forward a little bit. So hang on, let me go. I should say one last thing is that Erectus always gets the jauntiest skeletons I have ever seen in any textbook ever. Now, is there one more hand?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious, is there, where do we think that fire was used by any of these?
Oh, fire's a tricky one. We're not sure. Some people have argued that there's fire in Homo erectus. Others say it doesn't show up until later in sort of Neanderthals and maybe sapiens. Well, definitely by Homo sapiens, we're seeing some fire. Part of the problem is discerning hearth sites. So there's can I use fire? So if something is on fire in my environment, can I capture fire and use it? And then there's the controlled use of fire. So can I take that fire and continue to use it? And then there's being able to make fire. And each of those things are very difficult because generally what you have to find is a hearth site. So you need to find a place where they were routinely burning things, but also that they were burning things at high enough temperature that we can say, hey, look, there was something deliberately burning here that was not over here. So now we can feel good that maybe something was being cooked or something like that. So I don't have a precise date for fire. It's a good question. So I'm going to move us a little bit forward in time. This only gets more exciting. So that was habilis and rudolfensis, those first two. And then there's Homo erectus, who's around for a very long time. And then I'm going to switch to Homo heidelbergensis here. And I should say all of these names, they all end in ensis generally, because ensis is the suffix that we use to mean, comes from or is derived from. So heidelbergensis comes from, is the fossil that was found in Heidelberg. So you see that a lot in the nomenclature. So this is, John Durkee is a very famous reconstruction artist, and so you see this a lot. He also did all sorts of things on Jurassic Park with dinosaurs, so you come across his artwork all over the place. Heidelbergensis is interesting, and I have a Heidelbergensis here. That would be you. So Heidelbergensis is around from about 700,000 years ago to 200,000 years ago, and we find them across Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. And actually, I'm going to pick my Homo sapien back up here, so that you sort of see how these compare. So I'll start on this end. So you'll notice that they're similar but different, right? So there are some similarities, there are some differences. Notice from the front, the differences are perhaps a little more obvious from the front. Some very, very thick brow ridges on this Heidelbergensis here. They do have brain sizes, cranial capacities that are on the human, they're in the human range. So across the samples, they run from about 1,200 cc's to about, I think it's 1,500 cc's. So again, cubic centimeters. So on average, humans are about 1,350 cc's. So their top end sort of is within our top end as well. They do have this interesting, slightly elongated crania, so slightly longer from front to back. They have what we call a sagittal keel, so there's a little bit extra bone right across the top here. I don't have a good explanation for that one. And they have these very characteristic double brow ridges. So this sort of M-shaped brow ridge is very characteristic of a Heidelbergensis. So they do have, you can't see them because this one had lost most of its teeth as part of the fossilization process, but there are some, they're not massive, but they are relatively, they're a little big. The molars are a little bit big, the premolars are a little bit big. It's quite a wide sort of jaw compared to a modern human. And you'll notice something else here, which is a big thing when we're talking about humans, is there's no forehead. Right? So you'll notice that right away there's no forehead. And we're very picky about who we want to call Homo genus. And if you don't have the forehead, we're not calling you sapiens. So, despite the fact that these folks have very large brains, well within our size, they're a little bit more robust than us in terms of their body. They look a little bit heavy-faced in terms of what they've got in the front, but they have no forehead. And you can't see it here because there's no mandible, there's no lower jaw. But something else that's very characteristic of humans, and again, no good explanation for this, is we all have a pointy chin. Does anyone know what the name is? This is the specific name for a pointy chin? That's a great name. Kristen, do you remember it now? I know, they're rooting for you. It's called a mental protuberance. Mental protuberance. So it's something on the crania that sticks out, a mental protuberance. That's the one that you can pull out whenever your grandkids are bothering you and you're like, oh, you know what this is? And they're going to be like, no, you're going to have mental protuberance. And then they'll repeat it to everyone they know because it's a cool word. So,
M-E-N-T-A-L?
Yeah, M-E-N-T-A-L. So, chins, the pointy chin, is a characteristic of a Homo sapien. Right? It's weird. The stuff that we pick out to determine what is a Homo sapien, high vertical forehead, big brain, and then this mental protuberance.
Does Latin
mentum is the chin.
Yes. So a sticky out chin, a pointy chin.
There you go.
Ah, thank you. So this is Heidelbergensis. They were, they're roughly the same size that we are today. There's a little bit of difference between males and females. So their males on average, we think were about 5'9". Females were about 5'2". So again, not that different from a modern human population. And weight-wise, very, very similar. Males, we think, were probably about 136 pounds. Females were probably about 112 pounds, which given their heights makes sense. And remember, they're doing a lot of activity, so there's not going to be a whole lot of extra body on them. So just in case you're thinking, wow, they sound really small, they were. That's because they're working out all the time.
Anything about the eyes?
Not really. Mostly the eyes start to look different because there's a lot of this extra stuff on top, right? Because you've got that big brow ridge, and so sometimes the eyes have a tendency to look a little small. They do have to guess a little bit, so we don't know how much sclera there really is. We don't know, what color eyes they had. We don't know things like that. So that's up to the paleoartist. But otherwise, eyes aren't changing too much. There are some slight differences in terms of some things are more square, some things are more round, but doesn't seem to be significant in terms of vision. Okay. Now this is where it starts to get confusing. So if you weren't confused already, here we go. So Homo naledi, this is one of the newer ones that's been found, and I don't have a reconstruction of this one, so we're going to have to work with the paleoartist here. And these were the ones that were found in South Africa. So these were the ones found in Star Cave. So if you remember that the initial team that went in had to be very, very small, primarily women, because you had to fit them through the small cave openings. That's where this group was found and where they come from. We've now dated them to about 335,000 years ago to 236,000 years ago, so they're around, we think, for a little while. Again, the end dates may change as we find more and we date the stratigraphy a bit better. Their pelvis and their shoulders are a little bit like the group that comes before the Homo genus. So there's Australopithecus groups that I mentioned very, very briefly. So again, Australopithecus, just think Lucy, and that's a pretty good sort of thing to compare against. But their hands and their feet are very much like those that we consider to be members of the genus Homo. So their skulls have a little bit of what we call a sagittal keel, so a little bit of that little extra bony bump on the very, very top. Their hips aren't quite like modern human hips, so I cannot fit a pelvis into my box. I was dodging the rainstorm on the way in, so I apologize for not having a pelvis to show you. But a human pelvis is what we call bowl-shaped. So it comes around the side, so if you've ever poked yourself in the shower, you know that you've got bone right along the sides of your pelvis. This is very different than the other primates. So the other primates, think of a gorilla or a chimpanzee, one of our close ape relatives. Instead of having this bony stuff on the side of their pelvis, this is all flat to the back. So we say that the iliac blades, which is the ilium, which is one of the three major bones of the pelvis, instead of coming around to make this bowl shape, is flat and tall to the back. Now, as a human, having this extra bone off to the side is really important. You don't know why this might be important? I need to go to the very back.
I'm just wondering what you were describing before you asked why it sounds like those ones, not us, were able to swing their legs further and move them more.
Not necessarily, but you're on the right track there. Okay, now I saw another hand here.
Childbirth?
Oh, possibly, okay.
Carrying the child?
Possibly for carrying children. Oh, you're cheating. It's a marker for bipedalism. Somebody was an A student. So it's a marker of bipedalism because if you think about it, at every point when you take a step, you're standing on one leg. Now, if you didn't have muscle attachments on the side of your legs, it'd be very difficult to pull all of your weight over one leg. So you don't see chimpanzees stand on one leg. You don't see monkeys stand on one leg. Hopefully you don't see your dog stand on one leg. That would be very strange. Or cats aren't interested in that. If they do, be careful, hip dysplasia. So in humans, we have this bone, the ilium, that comes around to the side. And now the muscles that would have been back here have also swung around. So now when we contract them, you can now pull your leg over, you can pull your body weight over one leg. That's important because every time you take a step, you got one leg up in the air and one leg that's down on the ground. If you've ever seen chimpanzees walking, when they're knuckle walking, so you cast your mind back to the last time you saw a chimpanzee, because I know you all watch chimpanzee walking videos on YouTube every single afternoon. They are knuckle walkers, so they are not walking on the backside of their knuckles. And when they walk, they kind of do this, right? They go side to side. And this is because, of course, they're throwing their weight side to side a little bit because they don't have that nice, easy muscle pull. And also, they've got big toes that are out here. They're not in line with the other toes. So when they push off, you're going ever so slightly sideways. So you get that funny little waddle. So Naledi, we don't think did that. Naledi, we're pretty sure is bipedal, not as efficient as a modern day Homo sapien, but still gets around pretty well. Has these ilia, so has the top of this pelvis here, it comes around kind of like a bowl, but it's not a nice up and down bowl, it kind of flares at the top. And this is also common of what we see in folks like Australopithecus afarensis, so Lucy. Lucy also has these flaring hips. So when we say that it looks a bit Australopith-like, think of Lucy. That's a good touchstone to go back to. So if it were nice and bowl-shaped, it would be like, aha, a Homo pelvis. But if it's got that slight flare, so it's not quite nice and perfectly bowl-shaped, then we get very picky. We're like, aha, no. But we still keep them within the Homo genus. We feel pretty good about that because they have this slightly bigger brain size. They're in the 460 to 610 cubic centimeter brain size. We're now getting just to the very top edge of where our primate cousins fall. And so we want brain sizes for anyone labeled as a member of the Homo genus. We want them to be bigger than all the other primates that are alive today. Because we're egoists. We don't want to have small brains. We gotta be the big brain people. So, they're not too happy about that. But we do have lots of finds from Naledi, so this is a very productive cave. They've had all sorts of fossils, which is why we're able to reconstruct a big chunk of the skeleton. You have to take them from different places to put it together, but it works. And this is a skull of, I'm sorry, it's so small. This is Homo habilis, the little one that I showed you earlier. Homo rudolfensis, the slightly bigger one with that bigger brain. And then these two here are the lady. And then these are erectus down here. So the lady seems to sit in between in terms of brain size and cranial capacity between those two groups, even though it comes much later in terms of dating. So by later, I mean closer to present time. Once you start talking about time, it gets very odd. Now, Homo floresiensis, oh, I'm sorry.
For Italy, it's found in South Africa, right?
Yes, it's a South Africa find, primarily in the cave structures down there.
Yeah. I mean, is it possible that we're talking about a migration south rather than north and then out? And so...
Well, we've got Homo species all over Africa.
But Natali's only in South Africa?
So far. I can never say we're not going to find it anywhere else, because the second I do, someone's going to pop out with a giant paper that says we found 15 individuals in the Central Asian steppes, and then I'm in trouble. So far, finds of this type have only been found in these caves, but we can't go around digging up everything. So let me take the back question, and then I'll come in these two directions.
Nedalia is living at the same time as Erectus, but with a much smaller brain?
Yeah, so there's all sorts of overlap. There we go. So here's Erectus, and because Erectus is around for so long, everyone's going to overlap with Erectus. So again, everything that is roughly along the same horizontal here is living at the same time. So there are all sorts of creatures living at the same time. So this is Erectus, overlapping with Habilis, overlapping with Rudolfensis, overlapping with Heidelbergensis, overlapping with the lady here, because Erectus is around forever. Probably overlaps a little bit with Homo sapiens, overlaps with Neanderthals, it's going to overlap with Floresians, it's going to overlap with everybody.
So how did it compete with, when it has such a much smaller brain, but it's sort of the same geographic area?
Well, the question is, why do you think they're in direct competition?
Because they both contributed to the evolution of what came next.
So the assumption that's long been made is that if you've got two bipedal species, of course they're going to hate one another.
Right.
Funny how you, I said for a long time that was the assumption. I'm hoping that that's not what the assumption is today. But when we initially found Neanderthals, the assumption was, hey, Homo sapiens that were also around at the time outcompeted the Neanderthals, that they were somehow better than the Neanderthals. But evolutionarily, things don't exist just because there's constant competition. I'm sorry, Tucker. My head's too small. I'm on the lower Homo sapien range, it's a problem. My brothers have really big heads. So, there's probably going to be a whole bunch of different, well, certainly we know that there are a bunch of these different species. Even if we consider them all to be one species, and we're going to be a massive clumper, that just means there's a ton of variety out there. But we don't make the same argument when we see a bunch of birds that eat the same stuff. Right? We're just like, oh yeah, there's just a bunch of birds. There's enough food out there, so what's the big deal? The second we see another biped, we gotta kill them. So part of this is just to get ourselves to stop and ask ourselves, well, okay, why is it Homo sapiens are the only ones around, and is that just luck? I'm not going to have a good answer for that, because we don't have an answer for that. Now, I had a hand over here first, and then I'll come back.
This is probably really naive, but how does a Homo sapien species start and end?
Not easily. So there's no easy, it's not a naive question. There's no easy way. So with Homo sapiens, and with most of these fossils, we're looking for something that looks like us. As soon as we find something with a nice, tall, vertical forehead, a relatively big brain within our brain range, with that nice little pointy chin, we're like, aha, we will call you one of us because you look like us. We're, made in our image and all that. That kind of sticks in our heads. If you look a little bit different, so if you got some of these big brow ridges, if you have teeth that aren't quite like us, if you have a little bit of what we call post-orbital constriction, so there's a little bit of this pinchiness sort of right behind the eyes, we're like, no, you're not a Homo sapiens, but you might still be a member of the Homo genus. So a lot of it is just looking at the characteristics and saying, are we willing or are we not willing to categorize this creature within one of our current categories? Or is it something different? And is it different enough that we have to place it somewhere else? I know it's not a very satisfying answer, but so far we think that everyone here today is a Homo sapiens. We have not changed that idea yet. So we don't know when we're going to end, probably a thermonuclear war, but who knows? I'm going to stay positive. Let me go here.
Do you know why some of these species don't live long and other ones live
No
a
clue.
long time?
No clue. It would be nice and easy if it was something like Pompeii, where there's a big volcanic, eruption, and you just see everything die, or KT, boundary, or you see just a bunch of stuff die, and you're like, aha, big giant asteroid hit the Earth. But for most of these, we don't see anything like that. We just see something that looks different appear in the fossil record, and then disappears from the fossil record. And what that probably tells us is something about population density. So at some point you had a population that was big enough that something was able to fossilize, because fossilization is very hit and miss, particularly in these wet, moist environments that we lived in historically. And then they disappeared, right? So could they have been bred out? So they just bred with all of the other bipeds that were around, and so now they're not distinctive anymore? That is absolutely possible.
Did they know, like, like the dinosaurs disappeared because of meteors? I mean, could that have been part of it?
We definitely don't see any big strikes. We don't see any big, volcanic eruptions. We haven't found anything like Pompeii or Herculaneum that would be like, aha, we know why these, even in places like where this next one comes from, Floresiensis, here they're living on these very interesting islands. Many of them are volcanic, and they still survive. So we don't think that any of them have disappeared because of a big sort of mass extinction event. So Homo floresiensis, this is one that is from the island of Flores, so we do like to hide where they're from in their names. They date from about 100,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago, and you may be familiar with this one, because when it was first discovered, it got the nickname the Hobbit. Because they're only they're a little over a meter tall, so a little over 3 and odd feet tall. They only weigh about 60 pounds, and their brain size is only about 400 cc, so it's on the smaller end of all the things that we've talked about today. But their brain is smaller, but their bodies are also smaller. So it's not nearly as a small a brain as you might think it is, given their body size. They have teeth that are quite similar to others that are found on Java. So you might remember I mentioned Java earlier. Java was the very distant island in Indonesia that Homo erectus managed to walk to. Homo erectus, they that stick around forever. They got all the way down to Java. Flores is an oceanic island. So you can't walk to Flores. At no point in prehistory could you walk to Flores. You have to cross open water. But we don't have evidence of boats. And Flores is like 500 kilometers east of Java. So you're not looking out and going, oh yeah, that spot over there. No, you're just going. So it's quite possible that they got caught on one of these big mangrove rafts, and this is how lots of animals get to islands, is in storms or in places where there's sort of sandy beaches and sort of marshy wetlands on the edges of your island. You get tossed into the water on one of these big vegetation rafts. So when we say that Homo floresiensis may have rafted to the island of Flores, we don't mean they're building wood rafts and out their oars. What we mean is they're probably on, they get caught on one of these big vegetation mats. They get blown out with the current, and sometimes they land someplace new. Flores is also home to some giant rats, some other exciting animals that I want to talk about. But they're post-crania, so everything again from the neck down looks a little bit like an Australopithecine, so like a Lucy type creature. So their legs aren't super long compared to their arms, right? So their legs and their arms are a little bit closer in length to one another. They have somewhat wider rib cages versus a nice sort of what we call barrel-chested sort of rib cage in humans. So they do look kind of like one of those earlier groups underneath, but from the head. In the head, they look very much like other Homo members. So their brains are a little small, but we like they have a relatively flat face, their teeth are relatively small. So we like all of those things about them. But the finds on Flores, you thought they would be the only ones. We also have one of Tucker's favorites, which is Homo juliensis. And this is one of the very newest finds. This one dates to about 300,000 years ago, and we think might have stuck around to as recently as 50,000 years ago. So again, we're getting very crowded in this last 100,000 years. These are found primarily in northern and central China. And so they're unique in that they have very large brains. So of the samples that have been found, their brains average about 1,700 cubic centimeters. For comparison, a Neanderthal average is about 1,450, so 1,700 versus 1,450. Modern human average is about 1,350. So yes, Neanderthals on average have bigger brains than modern humans. Again, sample sizes. And then it looks like juliensis has an even bigger one. And that's the primary reason why they've given it this new species name. So I said, look, we can't, this crania, what's going on with this crania? Maybe it's got to be a new species because it doesn't fit anymore. So we don't know. Some people have argued that because we only have, some bits of the skull, not even an entire skull, but bits of the skull that you can piece together and digitally fill in the missing bits, that maybe it belongs to this other group, Homo longi. And Homo longi was identified first. So again, precedent, see if you can shove more things into the thing you named, you get to keep your name. So these appeared about 146,000 years ago. They're possibly as old as 309,000 years ago. But dating, because we don't have as many finds as we'd like, gets a bit tricky. This one was first identified in northeastern China, in Harbin. And so, again, this is a reconstructed crania down here, which is quite good. This is the reconstruction based off of that crania, so you can see what, it looks like what you put some flesh on. Very big face, very big nasal cavity, so space for the nose. So it has an interesting combination, because it looks a lot like Heidelbergensis. It looks a lot like this one, right? It's got these big brow ridges. It's got kind of this funky brain going on. But what's interesting is that it does have a bit of this, it has a little bit more of a forehead. And what it doesn't have is Heidelbergensis here has kind of a sharp, it's hard to tell. This is what we call the occipital bones, the one right at the back of the skull. And it's kind of pointy. And we find this on Heidelbergensis a lot. Not on Neanderthals also to a certain extent. Not so, it's smooth here. So attempts to place it into, say, a Heidelbergensis group, or place it, say, within a Neanderthal group, and just say Neanderthals got all the way to China, you run into this problem. Well, how do you explain the variation? Right? So this is a problem with all of these that we call species. What little bits are you using to make that determination? In the group that discovered longi, what they did was they fed a bunch of numbers into the computer, and they asked the computer to run what we call phylogenetic analysis. So take all of these measurements and determine what makes the most sense, what's the most parsimonious, as we say. So how can you connect these things in as few leaps as possible? So you want to do it without having to, you get brow ridges and then you lose brow ridges and then you get brow ridges again. You want a nice, easy line where you have brow ridges throughout, right? That's nice and parsimonious. And so when they did this, when they ran this through, one of their interesting finds is they found that perhaps this specimen and the specimens that are sort of clumped together in this species might be more related to Homo sapiens than to Homo neanderthalensis. So maybe it's closer to sapiens and not as close to Neanderthals. That's kind of weird. But let me confuse it further. Because then there's this one, which was found in the Philippines, possibly as early as 130,000 years ago. But the clearer dating is 67,000 years ago to 50,000 years ago. Some of the very, very new stuff says that we might be able to push it even further back. And they were looking on the island of Luzon because, of course, we found Flores. So we found Floresiensis, which was on an oceanic island that we thought no one could get to because you had to take a boat. So then they went back and they're like, well, maybe we should check these other islands. So of course, the most populated island in the Philippines, you start looking there. So they looked in this cave before, hadn't found anything. Now they dug deeper, and they did find stuff. So that's where Luzonensis comes from. They are relatively small, so again, about a little over a meter tall, 3 or 4 feet, thereabouts. Curved fingers and toes. So they can walk bipedally like us, but they're not as efficient. So they can't do as, they're not very good at running. They're not going to be great. They're going to get tired a lot more quickly, but when they need to get up into the trees, they're going to be better than we are. So there might be some advantages to this, particularly if you live in a nice tropical zone. And I want to end on Denisovans, and I also had to add Denisovans. There are a couple different pronunciations. The American version is Denisovans. The everyone else pronunciation is Denisovans. So I've been practicing and still get it wrong. So I have had to add them as well to this diagram. So I moved Juliensis over here. This is Luzonensis, the one from the Philippines. This is Floresiensis. Over here is the Denisovid, and this is Homo erectus. Oh, Homo erectus. And these are Homo sapiens, right? So Homo sapiens are overlapping with a bunch of these. Oh, Tucker, you're gonna slow me down, aren't you?
Okay, just please ignore this question unless you think it really answering it helps. But we see the vertical axis here is time, and there really is no horizontal axis unless it's something like cranial capacity or just similarity to.
No. So here the horizontal axis means nothing.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes, if these were of different widths, you could also do brain size, but they did not do that on this particular chart. So this chart is just showing time when we think these fossil species may have been around.
Is it anything like similarity to Homo sapiens? So Homo erectus is nearby, their stripe is near us because they're more like us than the Denisovans?
Nope. I wish. There are family trees that do that, but I chose not to pick any of them because none of them agree. So then I would be prioritizing one over the other, and then someone would ask me why I picked that one and not the other one. And
so if these are contemporaneous, the timeline, then we have DNA evidence that some of us carry Neanderthal DNA. So there must have been some other hybridizing and this makes it look like they are separate, totally separate species.
well,
At
so
the same time, but maybe not.
well, so the question is, are they the same species because they can mate, or are they different species because they look really different from one another? Right. So this gets us back to that: how do you define a species problem? So I just want to get to the Denisovans. And then I swear there's going to be room for Q&A. So these date to about 500,000 to 30,000 years ago. And what's interesting about them is we found them by looking at the Neanderthal genome. So we're looking at the Neanderthal genome, and we found bits that weren't Neanderthal, or we're looking at humans rather. We found bits that are in us, and we're like, okay, well, some of this is Neanderthal. It turns out we had this other stuff that wasn't coming from Neanderthals, and we took some Denisovans, and we took one of the teeth, and they drilled into it, and we got some ancient DNA from it. So they were able to construct a complete genome. So you have a complete genome of a Neanderthal, you have a complete genome of a Denisovan. And now you'll get numbers that are like, oh, you're part, Neanderthal, you're part Denisovan. And it's interesting because Denisovans and Neanderthals are very, very close to one another genetically. They're like 99.8% identical. So they're very closely related to one another. And then the next one that's related to them is us, so far. Now, we don't know because we don't have genome data from all these other ones that we were just talking about. So that may change. But so far, these folks, we think, looking at the whole genome, that they probably split genetically from Homo neanderthalensis, so the Neanderthals, about 400,000 to 500,000 years ago. So that's a pretty big split. But we do know that they seem to be interbreeding. So not, there aren't massive markers of it, but there does seem to be some hybridization, and that we are mating with Homo sapiens somewhere in our lineage, or mating with Denisovans, and we're mating with Neanderthals. So now you get these two numbers when you do, your genomic testing. It's like, oh yeah, you're 2% Neanderthal, but you're like 3.6% Denisovan. And it's in different areas. So Denisovans had a tendency to contribute much more in terms of those that are of Melanesian descent and Aboriginal Australian, so indigenous Australian populations. So we see more of this contribution across Asia, and particularly down into Southeast Asia, whereas the Neanderthals seem to have contributed more on the other side of the Altai Mountains. So the mountain range may have been this interesting split between the Neanderthals and the Denisovans. So I'm going to end first, and then I'll take the question. Otherwise, Tucker's going to give me a really hard time. So this all leads me back to this original question, which is, what do we mean when we say that something is human? Do we mean just Homo sapiens? Do we mean everyone within the Homo genus? And if we mean everyone within the Homo genus, then what traits specifically do we care about? Do we really care about the pointy chin? Do we really care about that high vaulted forehead? Or Does brain size matter more than those things? So this is why this stuff will continue to change. So if I come back next year, I will give a completely different talk with a whole bunch of new names. So hopefully you took notes so that when I come back, you can see the comparisons. But otherwise, I will leave it there. And then when we can open up questions, we've got a question waiting.
All right, let's go. Thank you.
Okay, so I'll take your question.
I had a question about, was a couple of humanoids previous that was talking about hunted wild horses. And so that must have been remains found in the middens. Is that correct?
Yeah, so there, let's see, which one was it? It was Julie Hui. I didn't find a lot of really good stuff other than it seems to be together with some remains that show some markings. So it looks like that these are animals that have tool scrapings on them. And we see that a lot across sort of the time period. Once everyone starts using some kind of tool, particularly stone tools, which leave nice big grooves when you scrape stuff, then we see sort of evidence of butchering or hunting. In this case, I actually don't remember what specifically, they keep mentioning the horses, but I have yet to figure out exactly what they were looking at with the horses.
So can we assume that the fire was used to have cooking at this point?
That's 100,000 to 50,000 years ago. At some point in there probably, but we don't know. Well,
I feel like
no, we don't know if they were using them, is the problem. So even if fire's out there, you never know which group specifically is using it. Until you find, again, when you pass, it helps if you pass next to our hearth, holding a rating, preferably on stone tablets, with perhaps some engineering markings on some stone tablets as well, so that when we dig you up 5 million years from now, we're like, aha! So we don't know. There's a lot of open questions there.
So you were talking about the two species that were very short. So do you look at the pygmies today, and do you see if there's any similarity between the pygmies today and those short?
Yeah, so there doesn't seem to be a direct connection there. So between, say, Floresiensis, it's a little further back. So between Floresiensis and I think it's Luzon, these two are sort of the shorter ones. There doesn't seem to be a direct connection to folks that are a bit shorter today. And mostly it's because it depends on the cause for the shortness. So there have been arguments early on that Floresiensis was short because of island dwarfism. So it was thought that because they're a bigger mammal that now stuck on an island, that you see this shrinking in size. They did have other animals on the island that did shrink. We know that elephants will often do this when they get stuck on islands as they shrink. But the rats didn't shrink. This big. The pictures are terrifying. So do not recommend that you look those up. So we don't know. But it doesn't look like there's a direct connection to sort of those current populations. Oh, let me go back to that.
As a follow-on to that, so the San people, the Bushmen, the Pygmies, those are supposed to be the closest humans. I mean, that's supposed to be the oldest genetic humans, as I understand it. Do we have a way of seeing how, we got from there to here?
So we don't have genome data for any of these folks. So there's no genetic data, so we can't do the comparison. What we do know is that of the genetic data that we do have from modern living Homo sapiens, which again has some big holes in it. So if you've ever done the now defunct 23andMe, please delete that later, Tucker. And you got your little ancestry report, and it said, you're 12% Irish and you're 12% French or whatever. That's based on current living populations in those areas today. They're not historical populations because we don't have historical genomes. So, but also, if you are of Icelandic heritage, your numbers will be much more precise than my numbers, which were 99.9% Southeast Asian. Actually, no, it was 99.8% Han Chinese, 0.2% Southeast Asian, because we don't have great data from the Asian continent. So my number is just like you and a billion people share some genetic information in common. You folks get Ireland. I get China. So we know that there's some bias in that data. The modern humans, we know there are multiple sort of migrations out of primarily Africa, because that's what the genetics is currently pointing us to. And we know that humans, Homo sapiens, left in a couple different sort of groups. The last one probably being about 70,000 to 60,000 years ago. But also we know now that Neanderthals, that humans go out, they're living in Europe, Neanderthals are admixing back in. So we're getting Neanderthal genetics back into some of those northern African populations. So we know that there's all sorts of stuff going on. And again, now that we can travel all over the place, there's a lot more admixture. Anything that's going to sort of genetically isolate anyone now, we're probably going to wipe that out pretty quickly. So, okay, let me come back here, and then I'll take your question, and I'll come around.
Do we know if many of these species had language?
We don't know. What I will say is that I don't think we should be surprised that if we think that Homo sapiens, this little tiny branch right here, has language, we probably shouldn't assume that nobody else has it. That's probably a bit of hubris on our part. Now, did they have language like we have, or did they ever get to the point where we don't even know when we started to get symbolic communication? What we see is that we see very symbolic, what we think is symbolic cave art and stuff like that, right? That's dating to maybe 30, 40,000 years ago. We see some rock art that dates back to maybe 60 or 70,000 years ago down in Australia. Unfortunately, a lot of that stuff doesn't preserve. So we just don't know for sure. So unfortunately, we don't know. So, okay, I was gonna swing around this way, so.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. When you get together with a beer, you're from the biological aspect of this, and you speak to your colleagues from the societal aspect. And by that I mean what environment these species are finding themselves in. As an example, you make reference to the giant rats, but if you look at the representation for the biologic evolution, they're only 3 feet tall. So I would think...
Wait, the rats or the people?
No, the people.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Or 1.2 meters.
Yeah.
Let's say 3.5 feet. And the rats are 2 feet. And so what effect does the environment have in terms of contention in promoting the evolution of what we're seeing as species?
So let me see if I can rephrase that and then tell me if I get the question right. So I think you're asking to what extent does the environment play a role in some of the variation that we're seeing between the various things that we're calling species?
Out of necessity.
Yeah, so we don't know. In part because in some of these places because they've only just found the fossils, they haven't done the full paleoenvironmental work yet. So we don't know fully what was around on those islands. We know some things, like we have some big sort of some of the big fauna is known. But more of that information will keep coming out, so we'll learn more. Now, we don't know if something like Floresiensis is smaller because of that island environment. We don't know. That's something that we have to make a determination on sort of species by species, because some species get smaller, some species get bigger, sometimes it just kind of depends. The problem is, when we first looked at Floresiensis, and we're like, oh yeah, you're small, maybe it's because you're on an island, it's because we're thinking of elephants. We're like, oh yeah, elephants always get smaller when you stick them on islands. But not everything gets smaller, so we took, we're great at taking one example and applying it to everything. And we did that in the case of Floresiensis. So we don't know why they're short. They probably, we think, have an ancestor that goes back to Homo erectus, and Homo erectus is within modern height ranges. So is it just that it was only a short population that ended up on that vegetation raft that ended up out there, and then now everybody ended up being short? I don't know. My family's kind of short, so that's why I'm grinning, because I'm thinking like my whole family being on a vegetation raft and getting stuck out on an island, procreating a bunch of short people. So we don't know. Some of this will definitely, so when we see changes in teeth, we know that these are changes in diet, they correlate really, really nicely. In terms of height though, because there are so many things that are going to affect height, that's a much harder thing. And we may find more examples where they're taller. And then we're gonna have to throw out any ideas that we had about, oh, they're only short. So, as always, I'm afraid I'm gonna have to say, I wish we had more data. Let's go dig more stuff up. So, okay, let me come around to here.
With the idea of rafting 500 kilometers, do we think that some species have like better toleration of dehydration, or like they wouldn't need water for? It's got to be more than a 3 or 4 day trip to see and eat everything.
Yeah, oftentimes these maps are quite large. So this is something that you can see on sort of satellite images after really big storms. You see these giant vegetation maps. So as crazy as it sounds when you're sitting here, it's actually not that crazy. So there's actually foodstuffs because it's all of the trees that have come down. You've also got all the foodstuffs on the trees too. So it might not have been as dire. So it might not just be those that can survive dehydration. There are probably things that they can eat and they're getting some hydration from that.
So when I had my DNA done with Ancestry, I had 3.5% African American, Middle Eastern, Greek, you name it. And somebody said that everyone should have African American, African DNA because we all come from the same source. Is that true or not? Or
Yes, but that's not what Ancestry is trying to tell you. So if you're looking for your evolutionary history, sure. Then absolutely, as far as we know with the current data, we all have a deep ancestry in Africa. We can trace back things like our mitochondria, not our nuclear DNA, our mitochondrial DNA, our Y chromosome DNA. We can trace that back to individuals in Africa. Nuclear DNA is a little bit trickier because, of course, things get intermixed with every generation. So every time you have a kid, you only pass on half of your genome onto your kid. And then every time they have a kid, they're getting a quarter of what was potentially you, and then on and on and on. So generally, the ancestry results, again, are comparing you against current populations. They're saying there isn't great data, though, because they didn't collect it, from African modern day genetics. So we have some, but we don't have a good comprehensive set given the size of the continent. So those numbers, generally, when you go back sort of year on year, if they're updating their data sets, those numbers should change a little bit as you move along, as they find new things to compare you to, and then they shift all those things around. So yes and no, because they're sort of working different time depths. Okay, now I see I have my back table there.
Where does the ice age fit on that map?
There are lots of them.
You repeat the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. Where do the ice ages fit? So the last ice age that we were particularly interested in is one that happens around here with the Neanderthals. And so we have Homo sapiens and we have Neanderthals that are living in southern Europe together. And during the last big ice age, sort of, I think it's like 15,000 years ago, but don't quote me. It's been a very long teaching day. The Homo sapiens retreat. And the Neanderthals, as far as we can tell, stay where they are. Now, why do we retreat? We don't know. It's just that fossil evidence disappears during that big glaciated period. And the Neanderthals hang out. And then when the ice age retreats, so when things warm back up, Homo sapiens go back into Europe. And that was one of those last big sort of migrations into Europe where not too long after that, the Neanderthals drop out of the fossil record. So again, it goes back to the earlier question that we had, is it because of competition? Probably not, but it may have had something more to do with demography. See, we got lots of humans that are coming in and they're making lots of babies and they're mating with you, and you are a smaller, isolated Neanderthal population, they're gonna overwhelm your numbers real fast, and anything that makes you special, that makes you stick out, is probably just gonna get wiped out, it's gonna get mixed in with all this other stuff. So I think we all have relatives probably that look a little bit like this one. This would be my Neanderthal. Poor Neanderthal. But it said that if you just put a hat on them, they look very human-like. So if you can't see the forehead, then they look pretty human. So, things that make them very, very distinctive disappear from the fossil record, but that doesn't mean that we don't still have traces of them sort of in the genome. So they're still around in that sense. Okay, so are you got thumb wars for it? Who wants to go first? Yeah.
Okay. My question regards Homo erectus. Since it has such a long history, and obviously they've been found all over the place, has there been some studies that look at how they've evolved and changed over those
There's lots of
over 2 million
arguments.
years almost?
There's lots of arguments. So there are some people that think that maybe this is not all Homo erectus. Maybe there are multiple species in there that should be broken out, the splitters. And then there are the clumpers. They're like, no, this is just change over time, right? We're going to link these all together. To be announced. So we don't know. It seems that they're very successful. They do seem to sort of wander. We see skulls that look very, very similar to one another around the world very, very quickly. After we have the earliest ones in Africa, we may find even earlier ones in Africa, right? So far we're just not sure. All that we know is, hey, this skull looks a lot like this skull, but they're in totally different places of the world. And we know that at the time you could have walked there during, some 10, 20,000 year span. You could have walked there. They weren't teleporting. But they get there, and then that means that before that time, they were probably already there, right? It's probably not the first ones that get there that fossilize. So even though we have these time scales, there's probably a bit more on either side. So we don't know.
But have they changed over this?
So erectus does, they change primarily cranially. So you see some changes in the crania. They get a little longer. They get more of this elongated crania. The brain gets bigger over time as you track them over time. We don't know why. But it's this relatively neat progression, and I'm sure that there are also ones that get smaller. So I don't want to give you the impression that they only get bigger. But of the ones that we've found, they make that nice little neat, like the average keeps going up as you look at, early versus middle versus late erectus, because they're around for so long. So there are changes, and people are arguing that, and whether or not they're so different that really they should be different.
I read in a recent science article that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred for 7,000 years, I guess on and off. But 7,000 years is a very long time. When did the Neanderthals become established? How far back did they go in time? And is that 7,000 years just right at the edge of their no longer being on the planet?
So, where did oh gosh. Oh no, did I not put Neanderthals in there? Oh no, did I cheat you?
We didn't talk about it, so I just wondered.
Oops. Look, here's another family tree to distract you. Wow, I really thought I put Neanderthals in there, and I spent a whole hour talking and didn't cover Neanderthals. We have definitely interbred with Neanderthals. In fact, it was from analyzing Neanderthal and human genetics that we realized that the Denisovans are probably a different group when we then analyzed their genomes. So during that 7,000 year period, it's because you're basically taking the mutations and you're counting back how long it would have taken. So they're like, okay, it's probably happening in this, because again, each generation is getting diluted by sort of about half, so you're sort of calculating back. We think there are probably multiple admixture events. So throughout the time period where we see Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, they're mating, and then they're still separate enough that we find them distinctive, and they come back together, and you see some more mating. We see examples of sort of what we call admixtures. So you see the two adults, and then you see like the kid that's kind of like halfway in between, and we're like, you mated with one another. As close as we're ever going to get to putting two fossils in a room to see what happens. So I would say that, even though we say 7,000, that number is probably going to change as we get more data in. And that doesn't include the Denisovan data. So we know for sure that there's some admixture there as well. And that's probably going on for quite a long time, given it's a larger percentage in some populations across the world, more so than what we see Neanderthals contribute. So.
But when did the ones we call Neanderthals sort of begin? I mean, when do you start their history? How long ago?
So there's a lot of argument about that.
Okay.
So it can go back as far as 300,000 years ago, and they disappear about 30,000 years ago. So we mostly don't argue too much about the 30,000 year date. It's the other one that they tend to argue over, because they can't decide, those that know more than I do, are arguing over whether or not Neanderthals are a separate species or if they belong to Heidelbergensis. So, you know, are Neanderthals and Heidelbergensis similar enough that they should be all one species? Maybe they're just all Heidelbergensis. Or are they really Heidelbergensis and Neanderthalensis? So unfortunately, there is also that argument. And then where do you put the Denisovans? Are the Denisovans technically just an outgroup of the Neanderthals? And it's unfortunately part of the same problem that we've been dealing with. I wish I had a more satisfactory answer for you. So, Kristen, did you have a question that I completely forgot about?
Talking about development of language in the Homo fossils that have been found. Have they ever been found with hyoid bones?
Yeah, a couple of them have been found. So hyoid bones are this little horseshoe-shaped bone right at the top of your larynx. So when you whisper or you try to hold a note while you're singing, you feel this little vibration right up at the top of your larynx. You don't have to squeeze very hard. If you're someone that likes procedurals, and whenever someone gets strangled, you always hear the medical examiner go, "Oh, they have a broken hyoid bone." Don't try that at home. So the hyoid bone doesn't tell us a whole lot about language. What it will tell us is sort of the range of sounds you can make, particularly vowel sounds. So if you've got sort of a lower larynx or a higher larynx, don't ask me which way around it goes. So we do have like a Neanderthal hyoid. We do have some various archaic Homo sapien hyoids. But all of that tells us is the range of vowel sounds. It unfortunately doesn't give us a language thing. Related to that was the FOXP2 gene, which is sometimes called like a language gene. And mostly it was identified because damage to this gene caused some interesting language deficits. But that doesn't mean that the alternative is true. It doesn't mean like if you have FOXP2, then you have language. We just know that if this is damaged, it breaks some parts of how you process language. But FOXP2 is an old gene, and actually we find it in a lot of other creatures, including echolocating bats. And so they use it as part of their echolocation. So, yeah, we're not quite sure where to put that one. Now, I saw another hand, yeah.
It's a multi-part question, so
Okay.
I'm sure you're ready to be done. First of all, where's Cro-Magnon on this? Secondly, I might be incredibly confused, but I'm not understanding the evolution part of this. I thought it was this evolved into this, and this evolved into this, but it sounds like these are all very distinct things. So how does evolution fit into this? And the third part of this question is, around the water cooler, or just in your own experience and hypothesis, is there any way to predict or guess where we're going? What's next?
Start with 1 and 2.
Yeah, we might have to stop the recording before I answer the third question, Tucker. So Cro-Magnon oftentimes fits within the Homo sapiens. So this is on this diagram, this is a Homo sapien. It doesn't show the nice clear sort of time bars. But it fits into Homo sapiens. We consider them just an old Homo sapien, so that's kind of where we fit them in. Oh gosh, remind me of the second question.
The evolutionary aspect
Yes.
of this.
So we don't know. So unfortunately, if we had a complete record, then we might be able to follow the differences and go, look, it changes a little bit here, the brows get a little bit smaller, and then we can sort of map it out and go, these things are related. But because we don't have all of that, so it's not like being able to breed racehorses where you can follow back the lineage in these very well-kept records, or even some songbirds in Japan where they kept very good meticulous records about breeding. There you can follow that difference. You can follow that lineage very, very neatly. Once you start getting to thousands of years, or tens of thousands of years, or hundreds of thousands of years, you get these big gaps where stuff just doesn't fossilize, and so you get these big jumps. So the big question is, do any of these directly lead to somebody else? We don't know. We can argue about it, and we can make some good guesses, but without the genetic data, it's going to be very difficult to come to any sort of serious conclusion. I think this is actually a reason why anthropologists like to have these debates, is because it gives you something to talk about over beer. You can keep talking for a really long time. The other thing is that we don't know. We don't know if these should technically all be different species. Some people have argued that Heidelbergensis, the ones that get trapped in Europe, eventually become what we now call Neanderthalensis, and that ones that stayed in Africa eventually become what we call Homo sapiens, the very early Homo sapiens. That is possible, but we don't know because we don't have genetics from Heidelbergensis. So we can't do that direct comparison. So all that we can do is look at them and go, well, that seems possible. We find them in the right parts of the world, and no one else is, we don't have any other fossils yet, so our best guess is, given the dates, this one looks ancestral to these two. If we find someone else, we might have to change that. So it's always a little bit tricky to make that suggestion, because there's really nothing but morphology, the shape of stuff, and oftentimes the shape of the crania, because again, the postcrania looks so similar that you can't use the stuff from the neck down. So the only thing that's really different is this stuff. And then you're just getting down to, can you find some inner ears somewhere and see if the inner ears have changed, and then you're getting down into nitty-gritty. We got a CT scan stuff and see if we can find it. But genetic genomes would make this a whole lot easier. But trying to get genetic data out of stuff that gets older and older and older and older is going to be tough. They're working on it, but it's going to be tough. And then remind me of your third question. Oh, that one. I'll come back to that one. Okay. So let me go to the back.
So you mentioned that there are a lot of the people who the first discoverers of these particular fossils get to name it, and then everybody says how similar is it to this particular one, and then maybe it's a subset of it. My question is, how many specimens do you need within a particular, boundary condition of, this specificity to say this belongs to this or that one of these species?
However the editors at Nature want. Sometimes it's only a couple. Sometimes you just need enough to put together a crania so that you can hold up the reconstruction and go, look, the brain's so big. This is clearly a new species. Yeah, Juliensis has fallen into this, so they got a lot of flack for that. It's like, is this real? It's got a big brain, so what? So part of the problem is, everyone wants to name something, so there is a slight bias towards wanting to find difference. But, most of us, especially those of us that have to teach this to other people, we fall somewhere in between, right? We're not total clumpers, so we're not like, no, there's only 2 species. We're not total splitters, because we don't want to cover 57 different fossils. I should say, in my own defense, I only talk about 12. So I don't even talk about all of these. I do this just for Tucker. So we, it's going to keep changing. It's absolutely good. And there are some that I did not talk about that are already out there. So there are like I came across at least another 8 there was no way, there just wasn't enough evidence for me to even add what we had for those.
Is that tilt down then?
Oh no, that one was a total hoax. So April Fools. And if you have not seen the spaghetti harvest, I highly recommend that you search for the spaghetti harvest. One of the greatest April Fool's jokes ever. You see the little Italian ladies who are picking spaghetti off of the trees. I recommend that you look this up. Okay, Kristen, did you have another question?
Yeah. Do scientists currently have a way to obtain mitochondrial DNA from fossilized bone?
Sort of. So we have mitochondrial. Yeah, so the question is, do we have a way of getting mitochondrial DNA from some of the fossils that we have? So there's nuclear DNA, which is the DNA that you have in the nucleus of your cells. There's 23 chromosomes, it's that DNA. But you also have a separate lineage, which is called the mitochondrial DNA. So every cell in your body has thousands of mitochondria in it. And mitochondria come from an old bacteria. that was sucked up into early multicellular life. So these little mitochondria, they're oftentimes an intro to biology. They're called the powerhouse of the cell. There's been all sorts of fun new stuff about mitochondria in the brain and stuff like that. So these mitochondria have their own little DNA loop. And so that gets passed on primarily from your mom. So everyone in this room has mitochondrial DNA. And generally it's come from your biological mom. So whoever produced the egg that you were fertilized from. And this is because the egg, being nice and big and full of nutrients, is also packed full of mitochondria. And that mitochondria came from the body that produced the egg. The sperm also has mitochondria in it, but most of the mitochondria are in the tail. So the part that gets it to swim. And then the tail gets clipped off when it ends up inside the egg. So biological dads generally are not contributing to your mitochondria. So you can trace your mitochondrial lineage. So have you ever heard that you can trace your mtDNA? This is what they're tracing. So you can trace, because it's basically copied wholesale, I can trace it to my biological mom. You can trace it to her biological mom. You can trace it to her biological mom. Mom's all the way up. So we do have some mitochondrial DNA from Neanderthals, and I believe we also now have it from the Denisovans, but nothing older. And probably the direction that the older stuff is going to go into is maybe not nuclear genomes or mitochondrial DNA if they're not able to get that, especially as you move back and organic stuff is broken down. They're looking more towards protein analysis because some proteins, which are bigger molecules, will stick around and last for a bit longer. So that's kind of the direction that I've heard things going in. Oh, so to get back to your, yes. Well, I will say that we've now seen at least tonight 2 species that have brains bigger than us. So big brains aren't going to save us. I think I'll say that right now. We are still changing, so humans are constantly evolving, and we're evolving in multiple ways. So we're evolving not only in terms of our bodies, right? So, we've got teeth where, a lot of us don't have third molars because we had to have them surgically removed because if you have your wisdom teeth pulled out, then you know what this is like. Or if anyone here not have wisdom teeth? Like you just don't have that tooth? Like it wasn't pulled out, you just never had one. Okay, there are some people, every year I ask this question, there are always some students that just don't have them. And it's not just because they're young, it's because they honestly don't have them. So we may eventually see that because our jaws are quite small to have a third molar. Oftentimes they're impacted, so we might see differences there. But, we don't know. I'm going to leave it open because we don't know what direction it's going to go in. And it kind of depends on how much we're going to be, to get back to an earlier question, how much we're affected by our environment and what sorts of changes that might produce. But also, I will say that humans are really inbred as a species. We're very, very identical to one another. So even when you get those ancestry reports, they're looking at little tiny differences that don't really change very much. They might not even be changing the amino acid that makes the protein that difference came from. But it's just a letter difference that shows up more often in people living in France today versus people that live in Algeria today. So we are very inbred, and generally when you find animals that don't have a lot of genetic diversity in them, when things change somewhat dramatically, you're not always best prepared for what comes next. So I will leave on that semi-hopeful note, maybe a little sweet and sour, but I will leave it there.
I'm sad that Julie said that if she comes back, or maybe when she comes back to give this talk again, that it'll be so different, because I think I understand so much now. Don't change too much. I gotta imagine some of these fossils are hardy to tell a good solid story.
You have to talk to the paleoanthropologist.
Right.
I'm not out there digging them up, so.
As we give a final round of applause to Julie here, as we do it, just keep in mind, thank Hop Monk and thank each other for coming out and for maybe giving to Wonderfest. Good night all, and thank you. Julie!